Martha Wilson was 57 years old, a woman who had built her life on what she believed was an unshakable foundation of love and trust. For 26 years, she had been married to her husband, David Wilson. Their journey began in the picturesque town of Cambridge, where they both attended university. Back then, Martha was a bright and ambitious student studying literature, while David pursued a degree in engineering. Their friendship blossomed during late-night study sessions in the library and lively debates in the campus coffee shop. David had always admired Martha's sharp wit and boundless curiosity. For Martha, David's quiet determination and kind smile made him stand out among the other students vying for her attention. Spent 2 years as friends before David mustered the courage to confess his feelings. To his relief, Martha felt the same. Their relationship grew steadily, built on shared goals and dreams. By the time they graduated, they were inseparable. David proposed to Martha on a rainy afternoon in London's Hyde Park. Standing under a shared umbrella, with raindrops mingling with their laughter, he promised her a life filled with love and adventure. Martha said yes, without hesitation, and the two began a life together that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. For 26 years, they built a home, raised 2 children, Nicholas, now 24, and Chloe, 21, and supported each other through every challenge life threw their way. David's career as a structural engineer took him to great heights, while Martha found fulfillment as a writer and editor. But life, as Martha would come to learn, often hides cracks beneath even the most seemingly perfect facades. The story began to unravel one fateful evening when Martha and David attended their university's 35th anniversary reunion in Bath. It was an annual event, celebrated with grandeur and enthusiasm, drawing alumni from across the country. This year's reunion was hosted at a historic manor-turned-hotel, complete with sprawling gardens and elegant ballrooms. Famous speakers and performers added a touch of glamour to the occasion, making it a night everyone anticipated with excitement. Martha and David arrived at the event arm in arm, their presence drawing admiration from their peers. They were one of the few couples who had not only stayed together, but also thrived over the decades. Friends often referred to them as the golden couple of their class. Title they wore with pride as they entered the grand ballroom. Martha's heart swelled with nostalgia. The room was filled with familiar faces, some aged and others surprisingly unchanged. Conversations flowed as people exchanged stories of careers, families, and life's twists and turns. David was in his element, laughing and sharing anecdotes with old friends. Martha, too, felt a deep sense of joy as she reunited with classmates she hadn't seen in years. The evening seemed, in years, perfect. A celebration of enduring friendships and shared memories. But amidst the laughter and camaraderie, a shadow emerged in the form of Alan Wright. Alan Wright had been a persistent figure in Martha's university years. A charismatic and outspoken classmate, he had always been vocal about his admiration for Martha. Despite her clear lack of interest, Alan pursued her with unwavering determination. Martha remembered him as a man who thrived on attention, always the loudest voice in the room. His confidence bordered on arrogance, a trait that often made others uncomfortable. When Alan approached them at the reunion, Martha felt a twinge of unease. His broad smile and enthusiastic greeting were laced with a familiarity that felt invasive. "Martha, David, it's been ages," Alan exclaimed, extending his arms as though he were welcoming old friends. Martha managed a polite smile while David shook Alan's hand. "Alan, it has been a while," David replied, his tone courteous but distant. Alan's gaze lingered on Martha longer than necessary, and she shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Throughout the evening, Alan seemed to gravitate toward their table, his presence increasingly unwelcome. As the evening progressed, Martha noticed Alan's behavior becoming more intrusive. He would find excuses to join their conversations, interrupting with anecdotes that often veered into uncomfortable territory. "Do you remember that time in the library, Martha?" Alan asked, his tone suggestive. "I always thought you looked stunning with your nose buried in a book." David stiffened beside her, but Martha brushed it off with a forced laugh. "That was a long time ago, Alan," she said, hoping to deflect his attention. But Alan was relentless. Over dinner, he brought up moments from their university days that Martha would have preferred to forget. His comments grew bolder, each one chipping away at the evening's joy. David, ever the evening's joy, composed partner, finally spoke up. "Alan, perhaps we should focus on the present rather than the past," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Alan raised his glass in mock surrender. "Of course, David. I wouldn't want to intrude," he said, though his smirk suggested otherwise. Later that evening, as the festivities moved to the dance floor, Alan approached Martha while David was engaged in a conversation across the room. "I need to talk to you," Alan said, his tone unusually serious, just for a moment. Martha hesitated, glancing toward David. But before she could refuse, Alan took her hand and led her toward the garden. What happened next would shatter the life Martha had spent 26 years building. The garden behind the manor was dimly lit, with lanterns casting faint pools of light across the cobblestone paths. The cool night air sent a slight shiver through Martha as Alan stopped near a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree. "Martha," Alan began, his voice low and earnest, "I've spent decades wondering what my life would have been like if things had turned out differently between us." Martha blinked, unsure how to respond. "Alan, that was a lifetime ago." "Alan, that was a lifetime ago," she said, carefully. "We've all moved on. I'm happily married to David, and I'm sure you've built a good life for yourself." Alan shook his head, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "But I haven't," he said. "No one ever came close to you. You were the one, Martha." Her stomach tightened, her instincts screaming at her to leave. "Alan, I think you've had too much to drink," she said, taking a step back. "We should get back to the others." But Alan blocked her path, his voice becoming more insistent. "I'm not drunk, Martha. I'm just being honest. Please, give me a chance to say what's been on my mind all these years." Martha felt cornered, her unease growing with every word he spoke. She glanced back toward the manor, but the garden was empty, and the muffled music from the ballroom seemed a world away. "I can't do this," she said firmly, stepping around him. "I'm sorry, Alan. Whatever you're looking for, it's not here." As she walked away, she could hear him calling after her, his voice tinged with desperation. But Martha didn't look back. She returned to the ballroom, her heart racing, and sought out David immediately. David was speaking with a group of their classmates near the bar when Martha approached. He smiled as she joined them, but his expression quickly shifted to concern when he saw the look on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, placing a hand on her arm. Martha forced a smile, nodding quickly. "I'm fine," she said. "Just needed some air." David studied her for a moment, clearly sensing her discomfort. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. Martha hesitated. She didn't want to ruin the evening for David. But the thought of staying any longer with Alan still lurking nearby was unbearable. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I'd like to go." David didn't press her for an explanation. He excused them both from the group and guided her toward the exit, his arm protectively around her shoulders. As they made their way through the crowded ballroom, Martha caught sight of Alan standing near the far wall. His eyes fixed on her. She turned away quickly, gripping David's arm tighter. The drive home was silent, the hum of the car's engine the only sound between them. Martha stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She debated whether to tell David about Alan's advances. She didn't want to upset him or cause unnecessary tension, but the weight of the encounter pressed heavily on her chest. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, Martha broke the silence. "David, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. David turned off engine and looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "What is it?" Martha took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Alon. He pulled me aside tonight in the garden. He said some things that made me uncomfortable." David's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "What did he say?" "He talked about the past," Martha explained. "He said he's been thinking about me for years, that he never moved on." David's eyes narrowed, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Did he try anything?" "No," Martha said quickly. "But he blocked my path for a moment. I told him I wasn't interested, and I walked away." David exhaled slowly, his grip loosening. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "But I wish you hadn't been put in that position." Martha nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't want to ruin the night for you," she said softly. "But I couldn't keep it from you." David reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You didn't ruin anything," he said. "Let's just put this behind us." Martha nodded. But as they entered the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left an indelible mark on their lives. The days that followed were marked by a growing distance between Martha and David. Though he reassured her that he wasn't upset with her, Martha could sense an underlying tension in his demeanor. He was quieter than usual, his smiles less frequent. Martha, too, felt the strain. Alan's words replayed in her mind, and she couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. She found herself avoiding social media, fearing that photos or updates from the reunion might bring Alan's face back into her life. One evening, as they sat in their living room, David spoke up. "Martha, I've been thinking about the reunion," he said carefully. Martha looked up from her book, her heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" "I don't think Alan's going to let this go," David said, his voice firm. "He's the kind of person who thrives on attention. If he contacts you, I want you to tell me immediately." Martha nodded, her chest tightening. "I will," she promised. Weeks passed after the reunion, and Martha tried to immerse herself in her daily routine, hoping the encounter with Alan would fade into a distant memory. However, her unease lingered. It wasn't just Alan's words that unsettled her, but the way he had looked at her, as if she were still the center of his world. One afternoon, while sorting through the mail, Martha froze. Among the usual stack of bills and advertisements was a small envelope with no return address, written neatly in cursive, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, chilling message. "Martha, I meant every word. Let's talk again soon, Alan." Her hands trembled as she read the note, the memory of his intense gaze flashing through her mind. She quickly folded the paper and tucked it into the bottom of the stack, deciding not to tell David right away. She didn't want to alarm him or reignite the tension that had begun to ease between them. That night, as David worked on his laptop in the study, Martha sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The note felt like a weight in her pocket, pressing against her conscience. She debated whether to destroy it or confess everything to her husband. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Martha began receiving anonymous calls. Each time she answered, the line was silent before disconnecting. Though she tried to convince herself it could be a coincidence, deep down, she knew Alan was behind it. One evening, while David was out meeting a client, Martha's phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number. This time, when she answered, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Martha, it's me," Alan said softly. "Please, don't hang up." Martha froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Alan, what do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I just want to talk," he said. "I've been thinking about you nonstop since the reunion. I know you felt something too." Martha's stomach churned. "I didn't feel anything, Alan," she said firmly. You need to stop this. I'm married, and I love my husband." Alan chuckled, the sound sending a chill down her spine. "You can say that all you want, Martha, but I know the truth. You're not happy with him. You deserve someone who truly appreciates you." Martha's hand gripped the phone tightly. "This stops now," she said, her voice rising. "If you contact me again, I'll tell David, and if you come near me, I'll call the police." Before Alan could respond, Martha ended the call and blocked the number. She sat in silence for a long time, her heart racing, clasped tightly in front of her. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. David's expression shifted to concern as he followed her into the living room. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her on the couch. Martha took a deep breath, then pulled the folded note from her pocket and handed it to him. "This came in the mail a few days ago," she admitted, "and Alan called me tonight." David's jaw clenched as he read the note, his hands tightening around the paper. "He called you?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Martha nodded. "I told him to leave me alone, and I blocked his number. But I'm scared, David. He doesn't seem like he's going to stop." David stood, pacing the room as anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "This is harassment," he said. "I'll handle it, Martha. You don't have to deal with this alone." Martha's eyes filled with tears as she watched her husband's determined stance. For the first time since the reunion, she felt a sense of relief. David would protect her, no matter what. The following morning, David contacted a private investigator, though Martha initially resisted, worried about escalating the situation. David insisted it was necessary to ensure their safety. "I'm not letting this man disrupt our lives any further," David said. "If he doesn't stop, we'll take legal action." The investigator worked quickly, uncovering details about Alan's life. It turned out that Alan had been married briefly, but had divorced years ago. He lived alone in a small apartment in Brighton and had a history of fixating on women who rejected him. When David shared the findings with Martha, her unease deepened. He staged, "I knew he was obsessive in university, but I never thought he could go this far." Martha returned home from running errands. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed a figure standing near the hedges. Her heart sank as she recognized Alan, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He stepped forward as she exited the exit car, his hands raised in a gesture of mock surrender. "Martha, please, just hear me out," he said, his voice pleading. "Leave," Martha said sharply, her keys gripped tightly in her hand. "You're trespassing." Alan's expression shifted, his desperation giving way to frustration. I just want a chance, Martha. One chance to prove I can make you happier than he ever could. Before Martha could respond, the front door opened and David stepped out. His presence was commanding. His eyes fixed on Alan with an icy glare. You have 5 seconds to get off my property, David said, his voice cold and steady. Or I'll call the police. Alan hesitated, his bravado faltering under David's stern gaze. Finally, he backed away, muttering under his breath before disappearing into the night. The encounter with Alan left a lingering tension in the Wilson household. David immediately called the investigator to report Alan's appearance and contacted the local authorities to file a formal complaint, while the police assured them that Alan's actions constituted harassment and they could seek a restraining order. The process would take time. Martha struggled to maintain her composure as the days passed. Her once peaceful home felt tainted by Alan's intrusion, and the unease followed her everywhere. David, though supportive, was visibly on edge, his protectiveness over her heightened to an almost obsessive degree. One night as they sat together in the living room, David broke the silence. I keep thinking about that night at the reunion, he said, his voice low. Martha turned to him, her heart sinking. David, I didn't encourage him. You know that, right? David nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that stung Martha deeply. I know you didn't, he said, but I can't help wondering if he saw something in the way you interacted that made him think he had a chance. Martha recoiled, hurt by the implication. David, that's not fair. I've done nothing but try to put an end to this. David sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm just angry. Angry that he thinks he can waltz into our lives and disrupt everything we've built. Martha placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. We're a team, David. We'll get through this together. Despite their efforts to shut Alan out, his persistence continued. Martha received another letter in the mail, this one more alarming than the first. If you won't talk to me, I'll have no choice but to come to you again. You can't ignore me forever, Martha. David's anger boiled over when he found the letter tucked under the pile of bills. That's it, he said, his voice trembling with fury. We're getting the restraining order, and I'm making sure he regrets ever trying to interfere in our lives. Martha, shaken but resolute, agreed. I want this to be over, she said, tears streaming down her face. David took immediate action, working with their lawyer and the investigator to compile evidence of Alan's harassment. They submitted everything to the police, who finally issued a restraining order. Alan was formally warned to cease all contact with Martha, under threat of legal action. For a brief moment, the Wilsons felt a glimmer of hope that their ordeal might finally be behind them. Weeks passed without any sign of Alan, and Martha began to relax. She returned to her daily routines, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of life. David, too, seemed to let his guard down, though he remained vigilant, often checking the security cameras he had installed around their property. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Martha smiled for the first time in what felt like months. It feels good to have some normalcy again, she said. David nodded, his expression softening. He told you would get through this. They clinked their glasses together, a quiet celebration of their resilience. But beneath their shared relief, an unspoken tension lingered. Both of them knew that Alan's absence didn't necessarily mean he was gone for good. The peace was shattered one Friday afternoon when David came home early from work, his face pale and his eyes dark with fury. He held his phone tightly in his hand, his knuckles white. Martha, he called out. His voice clipped. Martha emerged from the kitchen, alarmed by his tone. David, what's wrong? David held up his phone, his jaw tight. "I got an email from Alan," he said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "What?" Martha gasped, her heart pounding. David opened the email, handing her the phone. The message was brief but devastating. "You should know that your wife hasn't been entirely honest with you. Ask her about the garden that night." Martha's hands shook as she read the words. "David, I don't understand," she stammered. David's eyes bored into hers, his voice cold. "Did something else happen that night, Martha? Something you didn't tell me?" Martha felt the walls closing in around her. "No," she said quickly. "I told you everything." "He approached me. He said inappropriate things, and I walked away. That's all." David studied her face for a long moment. His expression, he seemed unreadable. "I want to believe you," he said finally. "But if there's anything you're hiding, now's the time to come clean." "I'm not hiding anything," Martha insisted, her voice breaking. "You have to trust me." David nodded slowly. But the doubt in his eyes remained, a silent wedge driving them further apart. Unable to let Alan's email go unanswered, David reached out to the investigator again, demanding that Alan be confronted directly. The investigator tracked him down to his apartment in Brighton, where a tense confrontation ensued. "You've crossed the line, Alan," the investigator warned. "This harassment ends now. If you continue, you'll face serious consequences." Alan, unrepentant, smirked as he leaned against his door frame. "I didn't lie," he said cryptically. "Your golden couple isn't as perfect as you think." The investigator relayed Alan's words to David, further fueling his suspicions. That evening, David confronted Martha once more, his patience worn thin. "Martha, if you're hiding something, I need to know," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I can't fight this battle if I don't have the whole truth." Martha, exhausted by the relentless pressure, broke down in tears. "David, I've told you everything I know," she said. "Please believe me." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I want to," he said softly. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story." Despite the feeling that there's more to this story, tension that had taken root between them, Martha and David attempted to reclaim some semblance of normalcy in their marriage. That evening, after the confrontation about Alan's cryptic email, David sat silently in the living room while Martha washed the dishes, the sound of running water filling the heavy silence between them. As Martha finished cleaning up, she glanced over at David, who was staring into space, his jaw clenched. The sight of him, strong, resolute, but clearly hurting, stirred something deep within her. She dried her hands and walked over, hesitating for a moment before sitting beside him. "David," she began softly, placing a tentative hand on his arm. He turned to look at her, his expression weary, but softened by the vulnerability in her eyes. "What is it, Martha?" "I hate what this has done to us," she said, her voice trembling. "I hate that he's come between us." David sighed, his hand covering hers. "So do I. But I don't know how to move past this unless I can be sure of the truth." Martha leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Let me show you how much I love you, how much I need you." Her words hung in the air, laden with meaning. David's eyes searched hers, and for a moment the tension seemed to melt away. Slowly, he reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her face. "You mean everything to me," he said, his voice low and steady. Martha leaned into his touch, her hand sliding up his arm as she closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a slow, tentative kiss, a fragile reconnection that spoke of both longing and pain. The kiss deepened, and Martha felt herself giving in to the heat that had been dormant between them for too long. David's hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the tension of the past weeks began to dissolve into something more primal. Martha's hands roamed over his chest, feeling the familiar strength of him beneath her fingertips. She pressed closer, her breath hitching as David's lips trailed down her neck, his touch igniting a fire that made her forget, for a moment, all the turmoil they had faced. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the couch where he settled her beneath him. His weight, his warmth, and the intensity in his gaze made Martha's heart race. "Are you sure about this?" David asked, his voice husky as his hand brushed the hem of her blouse. Their hands explored one another with a familiarity that felt both comforting and exhilarating. Martha felt a renewed connection with him, a reminder of the bond they had shared for so many years. Their movements grew more urgent, the years of intimacy between them, guiding every touch and kiss. Martha's blouse slipped from her shoulders, and David's hands traced the curves of her body with a reverence that made her shake. The two of them rediscovering the love and passion that had brought them together. As David's lips pressed against the sensitive skin of her collarbone, Martha arched into him, her breath coming in soft gasps. "David," she whispered, her fingers tangling in his hair. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of desire and tenderness. "You're everything to me, Martha. I need you to know that." "I do," she said, her voice trembling. "And I need you too. There. Bodies moved together in perfect rhythm, the years of familiarity enhancing the raw intensity of their connection. In those moments, all the pain and uncertainty seemed to fade away, replaced by the unbreakable bond they had shared for so long. When Martha woke the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt warmer, softer. David lay beside her, his arm draped protectively over her waist. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in weeks. She ran her fingers lightly over his hand, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of Alan's intrusion didn't feel as suffocating. David stirred, opening his eyes to find his eyes. Martha watching him. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. David pulled her closer, his grip firm but gentle. He began, his words trailing off as he searched for the right expression. "It was what we needed," Martha finished for him, her smile tinged with both relief and gratitude. He nodded, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Well, get through this, Martha. Together." And for the first time in weeks, Martha truly believed him. The intimacy of the previous night brought a renewed sense of connection between Martha and David. Yet, as the days passed, the underlying issues remained. Alan's shadow still loomed over their lives, his name unspoken but always present in their thoughts. Martha threw herself into her routines, hoping that normalcy might soothe the tension that lingered between her and David. She spent her mornings tending to the garden and her afternoons volunteering at the local library. David, too, seemed determined to keep himself busy, often staying late at work or tinkering with projects in the garage. But even in their moment of peace, the unspoken doubts lingered, like an unfinished conversation that neither of them dared to address. One evening, as they sat quietly in the living room, Martha finally broke the silence. "David, I think we need to talk about this, about Alan. David's jaw tightened, but he nodded. What do you want to say? Martha hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I hate what this has done to us. I hate that you feel like you can't trust me. David looked at her, his eyes weary. It's not that I don't trust you, Martha. It's just... well, seeds of doubt, and I don't know how to uproot them. Martha reached for his hand, her voice steady. Then let me help you. Ask me anything, David. Whatever you need to know to feel secure again, I'll answer. David studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, he said softly. Let's start fresh. No more secrets. The following weeks were marked by small but significant steps toward healing. Martha and David began spending more time together, talking openly about their fears and insecurities. They revisited the garden where Martha had first encountered Alan at the reunion, using the space as a symbol of their effort to reclaim their lives. Martha also started seeing a counselor, encouraged by David's suggestion. While she initially resisted, unsure if it would help, the sessions proved cathartic. Talking through her emotions and the impact of Alan's harassment allowed her to see things more clearly, giving her to see things more clearly. The tools to rebuild her confidence. David, too, found solace in his own way. He joined a local fitness club, channeling his frustrations into physical activity. The routine brought him clarity, and he began to approach their situation with renewed determination. Their intimacy deepened as they worked together to rebuild their trust. Nights that were once filled with tense silences were replaced with laughter and shared moments of tenderness. While the scars of their ordeal remained, they no longer defined their relationship. Though they had worked hard to find peace, the specter of Alan lingered. His name would occasionally resurface in conversations or through updates from the investigator. However, after weeks from the investigator of silence, the Wilsons received word that Alan had left the country, moving to France for a new job. The news came as a relief to both Martha and David. Though they knew Alan's departure didn't erase the past, it offered them a chance to fully move on without the constant threat of his presence. Do you think this is really the end of it? Martha asked one evening as they sat together in the garden. David placed a reassuring hand over hers. I think it's the beginning of something better, he said. We've weathered the storm, Martha. Now it's time to focus on us, with Alan out of the picture. Martha and David embraced a sense of renewal in their lives. They began making plans for a long overdue vacation, deciding on a trip to Italy, a place they had always dreamed of visiting. The trip proved transformative, walking hand in hand through the streets of Florence and along the Amalfi Coast. They rediscovered the joy of simply being together. The vibrant landscapes and rich history served as a reminder of the beauty life still had to offer. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a quiet terrace, David turned to Martha with a smile. You know, this feels like a second chance, he said. Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. Her heart full. It does, she agreed, and I don't want one to waste it. Back home, life settled into a gentle rhythm. Martha continued her volunteer work, and David began mentoring younger engineers at his firm. They made a conscious effort to prioritize their relationship, carving out time for dating, nights and weekend getaways. The scars of their ordeal were still there, but they had become a part of their story, a reminder of the challenges they had overcome together. One evening, as they prepared dinner, David looked at Martha and said, You know, I think Alan's intrusion forced us to confront things we'd been avoiding for years. Martha nodded, slicing vegetables with steady hands. It did. And as much as I hate what he did, ungrateful for the clarity it brought us. David reached out to take her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I love you, Martha," he said simply. Martha smiled, her eyes shining. "I love you too, David." Always. Years later, the Wilsons sat on the porch of their countryside home, watching their grandchildren play in the garden. The laughter of the children filled the air, a soothing melody that spoke of healing and renewal. Martha looked over at David, who was smiling as their grandson tugged at his pant leg. "Come a long way," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. David nodded, his hand resting on hers. "We have. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it." Their journey had been far from easy, but it had taught them the value of resilience, love, and forgiveness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, Martha and David sat side by side, ready to face whatever came next together.